Good evening, I'm Leland Vitter. In the Revolutionary War, George Washington realized holding this high ground over the Hudson River would decide the fate of our young nation. Since then, American soldiers have stood watch at West Point, and the United States Military Academy here has educated and formed America's greatest generals. And tonight, we reveal the temperament and the character that protected our nation since.
To me, West Point has always been a very special place, almost a sacred space in American history.
If you want to understand America's military tradition, you start at West Point. Today's cadets and tomorrow's officers train here on its famous plain, under the watchful gaze of the Academy's most celebrated graduates and some of our nation's greatest leaders.
General Washington, during the Revolution, he called West Point a key to the continent. He knew it was strategically valuable terrain, that we had to hold it to gain American independence. And ever since 1802, when the Military Academy was founded by Thomas Jefferson, West Point has maintained this prominence and preeminence.
Colonel Brian Gibby is the deputy head of the Department of History and War Studies.
We're the only military force on the planet in the history of the world that swears an oath to a piece of paper, to the United States Constitution. And we honor and recognize civilian control of the military as being a primary principle of our military ethos.
And that's different than any other country.
Yes.
Tonight, we want to look back at the men who both shaped and embodied that ethos. The great American warriors who have featured prominently in many of the books penned by America's most popular historian, Bill O'Reilly. A guy who knows that even the most lionized leaders are, like the rest of us, still imperfect people.
So our greatest warriors, generals, leaders, good and bad, all of them. And that's the human condition, the duality of man. But we mythologize in America our heroes. We make them into people that couldn't possibly exist. And that's my job, is to bring everybody down to earth.
We begin at the beginning with the general immortalized in so many statues, monuments, and even our money that it's hard to separate the layers of legend from the man. It's no surprise, right, that Washington is the one looking out on the plain.
Oh, absolutely. Well, Washington is probably the greatest soldier in the United States history. He exemplified, the principles of our military ethic, deference to civilian control of the military, and also the selfless service.
He was a warrior from a very young age, trained by the British.
French and Indian War.
And Washington gets shot 5 times, but he didn't stop. Washington didn't stop. Incredibly brave.
It was that character and his experience as a soldier that made Washington such an effective leader during the Revolutionary War as head of the Continental Army.
He is a commander, but he loves his soldiers, and he empathizes with them and their willingness to die for their cause, and he's not going to throw away their lives needlessly, which is somewhat in contrast to the aristocratic European tradition that was prevalent in the 18th century.
What does Washington do?
Well, I'll take two examples. The Battle of Trenton at the end of 1776. His army is literally about to dissolve because they signed up for 1 year, January to December. And the Continental Army had just been beaten and driven out of New York City and across New Jersey. And Washington recognizes this is it. If the army dissolves and we're losing, the revolution is over.
Remember, Washington was commanding not troops that were trained at West Point, not professional soldiers like the British had. He was commanding state militias mostly. Guys who were wearing, farm outfits, and they'd show up with a musket.
And so he talks to his officers and his men, and he convinces them, stay on for a little bit longer. Trust me, we're going to do something. And that's when he launches his surprise attack at Trenton and wins a great victory. And then he goes on 4 weeks later to win at Princeton.
Washington's speech to troops you quoted in Killing England. Let it never be said that in a day of action you turned your backs on the foe. Every motive that can touch the human breast calls us to the most vigorous exertions.
Yeah, Washington was a committed guy and saw the big picture that the colonists were getting hosed by the King of England, and he didn't want it.
That is exactly what the revolution needs, to get that shot in the arm that we actually can win this. And it's one of the few times where Washington, at the tactical level, at the battle command level, does pretty well. He loses most of the battles that he's engaged in, but when it really counted, at Trenton and Princeton, he wins, saves the revolution.
Washington's leadership was never tested more than in the winter of 1777. But for Washington, the Continental Army would have collapsed at Valley Forge.
How he kept that together, I don't know any general in American history who could have done what Washington did, because those men were literally starving, and it was freezing cold, and families are screaming, "When are you coming home?"
Can you imagine if there was cable news back then?
Oh, my God. Washington kept them together just by sheer force of personality.
He expends a great deal of time and personal wealth to keep the Army alive and to keep it together. And once the Army emerges from Valley Forge, it's much stronger.
But don't kid yourself. Washington's leadership involved more than inspiring speeches.
But he had a dark side. George Washington had a dark side. You didn't want to get on his bad list. You did not. And when someone broke ranks, he'd hang you.
He ordered his own men hung.
Hung. In front of everybody. And that was part of his discipline. Washington was one tough SOB, except when it came to his wife, who pushed him around.
After leading our new nation to victory over the British, Washington would lead it as our first president, a position he crucially gave up after 2 terms, even though he probably could have held it for life. When you teach Washington at West Point, what do you hope they take from it?
I hope they get a sense for his modesty, his humility as a leader.
Anybody who doesn't admire George Washington is a loon. The guy is an incredible hero.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe below and download our NewsNation app right now on your phone, and you will get fact-based, unbiased news for all Americans.